All right, welcome everyone. As everyone's rolling in here, I just wanted some really quick housekeeping. If you have a question during the session today, please be sure to use the Q&A available at the bottom of the screen to lodge your question so we can make sure that we get it answered. So let's get rolling. You're all here today because you want to understand how to determine, is my documentation adequate? So we're going to talk today about what you need to know about CMMC documentation so that you can pass an assessment. Before we get rolling though, let's talk about how we even got here. So if we take a step back in time, why did CMMC even come to be? Well, there was requirements that everyone on this call is aware of in DFAR 7012 that you had to implement those 110 controls in NIST 800-171 in order to be awarded contracts. The failure rate of those assessments that DIBCAC did, which was kind of like their test of the ecosystem. In other words, like let's check the defense industrial base, let's see how they're doing with the implementation of this. Failure rate was 100%. So nobody passed the assessment. At that time, they didn't just they didn't say, "Oh, you can't have your contracts." They said, "Like, fix these things." But they recognized that there had to be some kind of accountability, some kind of second check to make sure that what they required was actually happening. That's how we came to have CMMC in the first place. But then what ended up happening is that organizations that actually thought they knew what they were doing, they started to fail the assessments that DIBCAC was doing at the beginning. What does that look like? So we're talking about C3PAOs, and everybody on this call should know what that is, right? The organizations that are going to run a CMMC assessment, they presented themselves to DIBCAC and said, hey, we're ready to be a C3PAO. They came in, DIBCAC came in to assess them, and they were like, you know what? We're not even going to start this assessment. So these are people who should know what they're doing, who were not doing the right thing. And why was that? Because they didn't have the right documentation in place to actually show what they did. Maybe they configured an environment, said, here you go. But it was clear that they didn't have the right documentation and they ended up failing their assessment. So that's why we're here to talk today, because we don't want to make those same mistakes that others did, sidestepping those and being able to save a lot of time and a lot of effort. So I'm going to make you 4 quick promises for what you're going to walk away from this call on today. First, it's going to be really clear by the end of this call why those companies failed their assessments. I'm also going to show you why the checklist approach to CMMC doesn't work and exactly what that is. I'm going to demonstrate to you how to have a CMMC program in place, what that is, and why that's important, and how to use a system to implement the right documentation. So if you're new to the call, haven't talked to me before, I'm Leia Shilobod. I founded Intech Solutions, which is now Compliance CIT, as a security-focused MSP in 2006. Since that time, we have started to help companies that wanted to implement uh, 800-171 because it was in their contracts. We started to do that in 2017. And those companies, at the beginning, they were going through the motions of trying to implement, but we helped them to accelerate those programs and be able to achieve that confidence in their 110 score. So we've helped over 200 organizations with their CMMC compliance program and their documentation. In fact, one of the clients I think about a lot, they were really eager to start, and they took ownership in the program. They took ownership in the roadmap that we were showing them about how to achieve this, and because of that, they were able to achieve their 110 score internally by self-assessment. They are ready for assessment, and they are eager to get in line for their official assessment. I'm also speaking nationwide about IT security and about implementing these controls and IT for manufacturers. And our organization is a CMMC RPO. I'm a CCP and also a Certified Information Security Manager and the creator of the IT Documentation Toolkit. Now, in case you can't hang on to the end and you want to make sure that you get some more information, we have some resources available for you on our website at compliancyit.io/CMMC IT Doc Toolkit. So if you need to jump for any reason, you can also go there and it will give you some resources and ideas about how to do the right kind of documentation. So why is this absolutely vital now? Why are you on this call? Why do you feel this is so important? Well, we all know the rule is going to go final in the fall. That means that this timeline that we've been looking at for a long time and saying, when is this going to happen? When is this going to happen? It's going to happen now. So a lot of people are finally saying, you know what, we got to accelerate everything that we're doing. It's going to actually not just affect DoD contractors, it's also going to affect your MSPs and your MSSPs alike. And that was clear in the rule that came out in December that MSPs are going to need to get CMMC certified at the same level as their clients. Or if their client just needs to do a self-assessment, they're also going to need to do a self-assessment and maintain that documentation. Those MSSPs, that would be things like, if you have a security provider, or even for MSPs, it might be some of the security tools they have in place. Depending on what kind of information they have, they're also going to have to get assessed. The impact of this is critical. Another thing that I hear a lot, one of the biggest complaints, is that when people look at the controls, they say, well, you're not telling us exactly what to do. In other words, they're not prescriptive. So they're not saying you have to make this configuration change or you have to have this documentation. And the reason for that is actually good. They are more, here's what you have to do and not specific, because then it gives each organization the opportunity to understand how to implement those controls in their business as it is. They had to make a document that was going to be clear enough with what you have to do, and then open enough so that each organization can choose the best way based on your business processes and what kind of information you have to implement these controls. And it's also really vital right now because if actions are not performed on a regular basis, in other words, right now and into the future, and they're not documented, you haven't implemented CMMC. Because the fact of the matter is that CMMC is not a checklist. It's not a destination. You don't say, oh, but we've gone through, we have implemented these 110 controls, we're done. That's not how it works. CMMC is meant to be a program that is implemented to get to good, right? And then maintained over time. And you have to be able to show how you're maintaining over time. And we're going to show you how and why. So you might be asking, how do you know what kind of documentation is required? Or how do you know what that documentation is required at all? And I can tell you that very easily. The CMMC assessment process, the CAP, spells it out. Where? Right here. This is an excerpt from the CAP, and it specifically outlines that before you are even granted the okay to begin your assessment, this is the forework phase, guys. This isn't even like you're in line, you say, okay, I'm ready. They do a bunch of forework before they will even quote your assessment. This is something you're going to have to pay for. And that includes a preliminary list of anticipated evidence. That's not going to be, here's all my documentation. That will be like a list of what that documentation is that will be part of the assessment. They need to know that for two reasons. First, they need to know that to assure that you are prepared. So if you give them a short list or a list that looks like it's missing a lot of documentation, they will take their money for doing their forework and they will tell you, I'm sorry, we're not going to be able to do the assessment for you. Try again, come back later, we'll do a forework again. Um, and um, and also because they want to have an idea about how much documentation that they're going to have to go through because the assessments are all going to be time and materials. So they have to understand the scope and the magnitude of what it is that you're going to present to them and will be included in this assessment so they can actually give you a price to let you know how much it's going to cost. And you say, well, how do I know exactly what should be documented? And here's where you can start. The controls give us a clue. Sometimes they tell us exactly what we need. You need to have a process or a policy and or a policy for certain things. So look for clues like that in the controls. Sometimes they give us other kinds of clues. So in this particular one, they talked about defined. So how are you going to define your period of inactivity? If it says defined, that means it has to be documented somewhere. You can't just verbally say, oh, our period of inactivity to terminate network connections is 5 minutes. Okay, where is that written down? That's what they're going to look for. And then you have to have the evidence that whatever is defined is actually happening, and that's documentation. And then you have verbs like this, identified, identified, which is going to say, like, how are you going to identify that? What is your mechanism for identifying these things? And it has to be somewhere in some sort of document. And then after you've identified these things, then you're seeing words like limited. So that's going to be another verb to be able to show and prove your evidence that what you have identified is actually happening. But the thing you have to understand about your documentation is that documents are your control. In other words, they are the source of truth. So then you use that source of truth to see if what's happening in real life looks like your documentation. And if it's not, then one of those things has to change. Either your documentation has to change because it's not right, or your real life has to change and realign to the control. Also important to remember that the active configuration of your firewall is not documentation. So when they talk about baseline configurations, it's not like, oh, here, log me into the firewall and I'll show you. This is what our configuration is. That's not what a baseline configuration is. It's also not users in your Active Directory or Azure Entra. That's not documentation. That is real life. So where is your control? Documentation is also not a list of employees in your HR payroll system. So that's a start though, right? So understanding who are all the employees is really important because that's going to be a requirement. But you're also going to have to document what they have access to on the system, like what information they are authorized to access, if they have access to the facility, if they have remote access capabilities, all of those kinds of things. And that typically is not done in an HR payroll system or an employee call list. And then there's the question, do your IT people even have good documentation? And do you know that? Because if you're not technical, how do you know if the technical documentation is adequate? And the fact of the matter is, technical people love to have documentation, but they hate to create it. I see some of y'all on the call here. I know you understand exactly what I'm talking about. And then there's the problem that if they actually do have some documentation, that over time it often goes stale, and stale means useless. Now, it is a good thing if your technicians are constantly improving their processes, making things more efficient, finding better ways to do things, and adapting to all the changes that happen in a network. But when the documentation doesn't get updated and real life does not equal the documentation, you have a problem. There's also questions that people ask me all the time. What sorts of technical documentation should we have? What activities? What configurations? What format should it be in so I can maintain it and it makes sense? What's usable? And where does it even go? Like, where do I put this evidence? How do I gather it all up? Key point here, guys. No one person or IT company can do it all. If you say, um, you know, okay, so Bob at my company, he handles CMMC, and you walk away, that's not going to work. If you say, well, my IT company does it, that's not going to work because The fact of the matter is that there is no abdicating your CMMC compliance to an outside organization. The risk lies with the company that has the contract. Can you get help? Yes. Should you get help? Probably. But in the end, the risk and the ownership lies with that company. And it's key that collaboration is necessary to have good IT documentation. This includes having a shared responsibility matrix in place. Steve asks in the Q&A for the SRM, the shared responsibility matrix, should an external services provider like an MSP or an MSSP provide the shared responsibility matrix, or should the OSC, the company that's going to get assessed, create one? And that's a really good question. We actually have this free report that you can find on our website about the imperative of a shared responsibility matrix that lays that all out for you. But at a high level, I can tell you that typically you're going to want to have a shared responsibility matrix issued from your external services provider, your MSP or your MSSP, so that there's clarity on which one of those controls that they're responsible for, which one you're responsible for, and how on a single control there is actually shared responsibility for both parties. And then once you receive that, you need to review it. You need to make sure it makes sense to you, ask questions where you don't think it's very clear. And if you have a concern about that, you should be bringing it up with your provider. There might be a misunderstanding that you need to clear up. Or maybe you got involved with the service and you thought they were handling things that they're not going to handle. You need to know that up front. Additionally, the SRM is going to inform who's going to be responsible for what kind of documentation and what information needs to be shared between organizations so that the documentation is accurate and remains accurate. But the fact of the matter is, guys, that this is not all about just IT documentation, because some of the documentation that's required is not technical. Think about the domains like physical security and personnel security. They have something to do with IT, but usually very little to do with it. How you are securing your facility, how you're escorting visitors, how you're screening people, how you authorize them to access information, all of that is going to be owned by different roles inside of the company. And some of that documentation actually requires a joint effort. What do I mean? Well, the first one is the incident response plan. If you're the company that needs compliance and you have your own incident response plan and you have an MSP or an MSSP, then they have to follow that plan. If you have a plan and they don't know what it is or how to follow it, then you don't actually have an incident response plan. You have a piece of paper that says incident response plan on it. IT security policies must be understood by both organizations. Why? Because if you have somebody helping you with any of the IT maintenance, security, configuration, anything like that, they need to know your IT security policies to assure that what they're doing aligns with what you have in policy, and also that they're capable of doing it. And there's going to always be a component, like we mentioned, of people and having to document information about people. And you're going to know your people. You're going to know if they're still at the organization or not. You're going to know what they should have access to and what they shouldn't have access to, and what kind of capabilities they can have, like remote access. So if you don't share that information quickly or on a regular basis, then even if you have an IT person or an MSP helping you to manage your environment, then you're going to be out of compliance because you fired somebody and you didn't tell your MSP, or you said, this actually happened before. One of our clients told us, okay, we have this new person starting, they're an engineer. They need to have all of the same permissions as Joe. And so my team gave them all the permissions that Joe had. And when we went back through to do our assessment and we looked at everybody who had access to the system and who had access to CUI, the president of the company was like, whoa, 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 wait a minute. This guy is not supposed to have access to CUI. Why does this guy have access to CUI? And I started to sweat just a little bit, to tell you the truth. And so I went back and I looked at change management to find out when we configured this guy. I looked at the ticket, and in the ticket, his manager actually said, give this guy the same permissions as Joe. And so we did exactly as we were told. But if we didn't have that check back, then we would have somebody who had access to CUI who wasn't supposed to be, and we would be out of compliance. So collaboration and documentation is absolutely required. Now, you don't want your documentation to stop you from achieving certification because you know you're going to drop between 25,000 and 75,000 depending on the scope and complexity of your organization on an assessment every 3 years. So the key there is that when you present for assessment, you need to have documentation showing that you are taking action over time. So you're responsible. You want to make sure that when you present yourself for assessment, especially since you know you have to do this for work, you don't want to flush that money down the drain. You want to make sure you're properly prepared and that you glide right through this assessment. Key here about this happening every 3 years for you to all think about is that let's say you present yourself for an assessment and you've been working really hard, you got 110, you went to the assessment, and the assessor is not expecting to see a ton of evidence about this program over time because it's your first assessment. But what they will be expecting, and I know this because I've been talking to assessors frequently about this, is that when you present yourself for the next assessment 3 years later, that they're going to be looking for evidence of that program being maintained over that last 3 years. This cannot be a hurry up and get it compliant again thing. That will not work. Now, what's going to happen when organizations choose to do that and they fail? I don't know. We're not there yet, but let's just do the right thing and make sure that that doesn't happen to anyone on this call. Finally, I know that everyone here is dedicated to delivering on the contracts, whether this is people who are on the call, who are in the supply chain, dedicated to delivering on those contracts, or whether you're an MSP on this call today, you're dedicated to your clients and dedicated to keeping information secure so that everybody has jobs and everyone continues to make money. So let's make sure that we do this right. What does right look like though? All right, here's a couple of things. Now, honestly, guys, we don't have enough time for me to tell you all the things. So I'm going to give you some highlights, some things that you are going to make sure that you are doing now. The first thing is to make sure that your system security plan is always up to date. So that system security plan is going to include a detailed explanation of how you're currently implementing all 110 controls. It also needs to reference other supporting documents that show how you're implementing that control. So maybe back, a couple slides ago when we were talking about defined, maybe you're going to reference your IT security policies and certain control variables are defined in your IT security policy. So you need to make sure that all of that is linked together in the system security plan. Another thing, you have to make sure that you're doing regular security assessments. And then you say, hey, Leia, no problem. Our IT people are already doing security assessments for us. But hang on a minute, guys. In NIST 800-171, the CA family security assessment is not a security scan or a penetration test. So what they say specifically inside of security assessment controls is that it tests the satisfactory implementation of all 110 controls. It also has to happen at least once a year. If you're, like a security assessment crazy person and you want to do that every month or every quarter, you can, but I'd recommend just once a year. You also have to have documentation that you completed the security assessment, not just hey, we completed the security assessment. You actually have to show that you did those things, those activities. Where's the documentation on that? And documentation on the variance between what the control says to do, what real life is, and how you remediated it. So that all has to be included within security assessments. Another thing you have to make sure you're doing is regular risk assessments. For those of us on the call that are manufacturers, got a risk register? If you do, are you adding risks that are being discovered that have to do with or affect CMMC or 800-171 or these contracts? Are those on your risk register? You also have to have a mechanism or trigger for when risk assessments happen. So it needs to happen at least once a year that you're meeting to assess risks. But still, when are you going to do that? And how are you going to know it's time? You also ask yourself, what are you going to do during a risk assessment? And so you could say, well, we're gonna run some scans and look at some risk. Well, we know that's not exactly it either. So what kinds of activities do we need to do during a risk assessment? And who does which thing? And I see a hint here. It cannot solely be an IT function. Why? Directly from the control, you have to periodically assess the risk to organizational operations, including mission functions, image, or reputation. A lot of those things have nothing to do with IT, including organizational assets and individuals. So risk assessment cannot simply be, oh, the IT is doing risk assessment too. It has to be a collaborative effort throughout the entire organization to assess the risk, to have a mechanism to know when you're supposed to do that, to have some documentation on what exactly are you doing, because you don't want to make that up every single time. That's going to make it entirely too complex and take longer. You want it to be as efficient as possible. And then identifying who does which thing. You also need to have a program in place. So I said that a couple of times already. You need to have a CMMC program. So if you think about NIST 800-171 or CMMC as a checklist or a finish line, it's possible that you can pass your first assessment, but like we talked about, you're going to fail subsequent ones. Think about this as, a lot of us manufacturers have safety programs. Safety program is a continuous effort to assure the safety of employees and visitors. There's training involved, there is documentation involved, there's a handbook involved because you know that you're like, okay, we did all these things and now we are safe. Like that's not how it works, right? So take that same idea of a safety program and apply it to this idea of a cybersecurity compliance program for CMMC and then assure that the compliance will be continuous, just like safety is continuous in your organization. And the great thing about that is that when you stop looking at CMMC as a checklist and you actually implement a program, then you can increase your security by leaps and bounds because you have a step by step what we're doing, when we're doing it, checks and balances, and documentation, accountability that everything is happening the way that it is. And it gives you the opportunity to also identify some security risks to the organization that maybe don't have to do with compliance, but still pose a risk to your company. Because obviously, like we're not all here because we just want to do the government's bidding and implement 110 controls. We're here because we want to grow our businesses and make money. And we need to secure our businesses too. So get 10x the value and implement a cybersecurity compliance program. So let's pull all this together. So what do I have to do? Oops, there we are. We need to make sure that documentation is all together because it's the first thing you're going to need before an assessment. Documents are your control. They allow you to assure that the company is aligned. And then you use that control to see if the environment is actually in real life doing the thing that is on paper, or if it's not, which one needs to change. We're not going to put up 25,000 to 75,000 and risk losing that, or, at the very least, a couple grand to be told we're not ready for an assessment, or go through the stress of a CMMC assessment unless we're totally prepared. You have to assure that you have both operational and technical documentation and that it is solid. You need to have a system for assuring your SSP, as well as other supporting documentation is up to date and is being used. Guys, I'm saying that and I'm telling you that, like, I experience SSPs, POAMs, SOPs, and other procedures going stale fast. I had one client that we were reviewing their visitor access facility process that was written, and I asked them if they had a process. Yes, we have a process. Okay, well, why don't you bring it up for me? And I looked at it and I'm like, oh, it's missing a couple things here, including that you escort visitors. Really? I didn't realize that. I'm like, well, I read it, so maybe you didn't, but or haven't for a long time. And so when was the last time this procedure was updated? And they're like, oh, a couple years ago. And then I looked at the date. It was 10 years ago. 10 years ago. Yeah, it goes stale fast. You also have to make sure that regular security assessments are providing you with the assurance the controls are implemented effectively. It gives you that opportunity to be able to say on a regular basis, on a periodic basis, is what it says, that you are actually maintaining those controls. Because the thing about all these environments is that people are working on them every single day. You have end users that are making changes every day. You have technicians and engineers that are making changes in the environment every single day. You have updates to systems that are happening every day. And sometimes you implement new technology. So you have to assure that even on those new changes, that it's still aligned to the controls. And make sure that risk assessments are actually tracking the success of your CMMC cybersecurity program so that you can make pivots when necessary. It's more of a strategic and accountability mechanism for your organization. And the bottom line is that when you have a robust CMMC cybersecurity compliance program in place, it doesn't only get you compliant, it actually shows you results. And that's what so many people keep asking me about. Why do we have to go through all this pain? If you look at it like it's painful, it's going to be painful, and you're going to put a lot of time, money, and effort in it and just be ticked off. But if you see this from the perspective of a cybersecurity compliance program and it actually helping your organization to get better, be better, do better, and be more secure, then you 10x your investment. So you're probably wondering, what do I do next? Because I gave you a lot of information. So you're going to implement a CMMC cybersecurity program in your company, and that's what you're going to start calling it. You're not just going to say, I'm implementing CMMC. You're going to add cybersecurity compliance program so that everybody changes their mind about what this is and how they're going to approach it. You're going to get compliance actions in place and a cadence for how those actions are going to be done and when they're going to be done so that everybody knows in the program who does which thing when to stay compliant. When you do that and you have a good process, you're also going to see where documentation needs to be aligned with your day-to-day practices. So you're going to do that too, get everything aligned with your day-to-day practices. And then you're going to check to make sure you've got the right documentation in place for management of the program and for collecting the evidence that it's working. Now you're probably wondering, how can we do this? You can definitely do this on your own. This is a great outline for trying to figure out how to create your own cybersecurity compliance program. You can definitely go back to your compliance consultant, demand that they get the right documentation in order. That's possible. Or you can engage someone who has successfully done this time and time again. So I've got great news for you. You can access our years of experience in implementing and maintaining CMMC cybersecurity compliance programs for companies absolutely free. You say, that's awesome, Leia. How do I do that? Well, because you joined the call today, I'm offering you a no obligation CMMC documentation and program consult. And this does not matter whether you're on the call and you happen to be an MSP or an MSSP, or you are an organization that's trying to implement this internally, because all of us have to do it. If you're on this call, you have to do it. Otherwise, you wouldn't be here. So I'm here to help everyone to get this right. We need good MSPs and MSSPs in this ecosystem to be able to help organizations that are not only skilled, but are also competent in order to do this. So I'm here to help everyone. In 30 minutes, I'm going to do the following for you. I'm going to review the DFAR 7012 documentation you have in place now, or help you see what's missing. I'm going to review your SSP and look specifically for what assessors are looking for and what your process is for keeping it up to date. I will tell you where there are areas that you really need to kind of beef things up, and also what an assessor is going to be really looking at specifically in order to pass you. I'll review your incident response plan. We're going to talk about how you're actually using it. And that does also mean tabletops, which I hope everyone on this call is doing. I'm also going to provide you with a checklist to see if you've got all the different documentation you need. Now, remember that everybody calls things different things. Most people call incident response plan an incident response plan. Some people call setting up a new computer, set up a new computer SOP. Sometimes they call it configuring a new computer. It doesn't matter exactly what it's called. The idea is here's a checklist of the kinds of things you have to make sure that you have documentation for. I'm going to give that to you so you have higher confidence and you can start to see where the gaps are. I'm also going to talk to you about your process to keep all of that documentation alive in the organization so you can pass your assessment. Because when you have this much documentation, it is a heavy lift unless you have a strategy for keeping it aligned and accurate. So in this program consult, I'm going to bring my years of experience of trial and error and show you where the gaps are, or maybe give you peace of mind that you're on the right track, and that's awesome. I'm going to guarantee that those 30 minutes will be valuable and that you're going to walk away with action items from that call. If after that 30-minute call you think it was a total waste of your time, I'll just donate $500 to the charity of your choice because I believe that strongly in our ability to be able to help you, as well as the fact that we need to get this right in order to pass assessment. So how do you claim your 30-minute CMMC IT documentation consult? You're going to email info@compliancyit.com with the subject doc consult and made it really short so you didn't have to type too many characters. And I promise we'll schedule that consult for you in the next 14 days. But the only challenge here is that I can only offer that consult for 7 companies, and they have to be scheduled by the end of the day. I'm traveling to speak more on CMMC these next few months. I've got speaking engagements booked at some conferences, and we have a lot of companies that we're helping since the deadline for CMMC is going live fast. So I don't have a ton of time in our schedule to make sure that we can get this information to you. So 7 companies, and please schedule by the end of today to make sure that you can take advantage of this. This is real time, like my real time and valuable information that people pay me for every single day. So I just simply cannot do this for everybody. So again, if you want to sit on the phone with me, show me what you got, and I can tell you where your gaps are, email info@compliancyit. That's not right. Fudge. All right, that's good. Hang on a second. So it's going to be compliancyit.io. So all of you guys are now not able to claim that. All right, hang on a second. Sarah, do me the favor of emailing everybody after this the slides and the right email address so that they can actually claim this. How about we do that?
Copy that.
All right. Again, that's IO. Why? Because IO sounds cool at the end. It sounds cooler than .com. All right, Steve has a question. Is an MSP an ESP? Is an MSP a CSP? Is an MSSP a ESP? And that's some lovely acronym salad. That's a good question. ESPs, external services providers, are any company that is external to your organization that's providing you with some kind of a service that's going to help you to achieve and maintain compliance. That could be a CSP, a cloud services provider. For instance, if you have your information in Microsoft 365, if you have CUI there, um, whether that's email, SharePoint, anything like that, or even, anything in Azure that might have CUI on it, then they would be your CSP. An MSP is also an ESP, an external services provider. So is an MSSP. Companies that will not need to get certified will be organizations that are only providing you with compliance consulting and do not have access to your environment, are not hosting any of your data. So those companies do not need to be certified. Um, if if whatever service or company you're using is going to help you to transmit, store, or process CUI, then they need to either be FedRAMP authorized or FedRAMP moderate equivalent and get a letter of attestation from a 3PAO that they have achieved that. All right, guys. So remember, claim the spot so I can help you on this journey. And Sarah will get you the right email address. Actually, it's possible the .com will still come to us. I buy lots of domain names. Um, and um, and then I'll see you next time around. Stay secure and compliant.